we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks everybody for joining the huddle. It's our every month on the third Wednesday installment of your supportive growth channel to really connect you to the resources, network, and coaching that you need. We have got Jeff Lucas and Kathy Patton with Employers Resource Association today. And we'll get into what they're going to cover in a second. But it's really all about avoiding HR pitfalls, which an employee handbook can be kind of that first step in helping you kind of set the framework and the stage for your company to potentially avoid things that could be problematic and cause you a lot of consternation and pain later. But maybe for their benefit, would love to have everybody introduce themselves. So your name and your company primarily, and then who might be with you. I know, Paul, in your case, you found the right person. And so let's just take like no more than 30 seconds a person to go ahead and introduce each other for their benefit. So Paul, go ahead and start on your end, and then I'll direct traffic. We can't hear you.
I have double mute on, sorry. So my name is Paul Mikulski. In the room with me, a safe distance away, is Todd Asseltine. We're running a couple companies. At the HCDC, we have 212 Environmental Products. And we moved in a couple years ago and finally starting to get off the ground with the products company and have had some exciting developments. We have a plan, an employee plan for our consulting firm, but we don't have one yet for our products company. So I'll be interested in hearing more about this.
Cool. Pat
Longo?
Yeah, you.
Yes, okay. Hi, I'm Pat Longo, president of HCDC and also the Business Center. Been part of the company for 25 years. ERA, we are a client or a member. I want to make sure I use the right term. And you guys have been very helpful with us in our HR situations. And I know, and I can say this with effect, you will be helpful in the future for us as well. So thank you.
Anthony.
Yeah, hey, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. Very appreciative of Kathy and Jeff for their participation today. I'm with the Business Center, director of the Business Center, and love these huddles, love getting everyone together and just kind of sharing their challenges, positive, negatives, so love these sessions, and hopefully this one will be of value, which I'm certain it will be, and looking out into the future. So thanks again for joining.
Trish.
Hi, Tricia Safakis. I'm with HCDC as well. I'm the marketing director. I'm excited that we're able to bring this information, find subject matter experts to bring this information to our clients. So excited to hear what they have to say, and hopefully this helps our clients.
Cool. So Olivier.
Hi, I'm Olivier Fisher. I'm the president of Transmissions. We do software development. We're on the 4th floor of HTBC, and I have one full-time employee, and I don't have any HR stuff except a contract. So I guess I'll be interested in seeing what you have to say.
Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Mcbride, and I'm an account manager with Employers Resource Association. So I'm happy. I just wanted to join and sit in and learn and listen to what Jeff had to say, and excited to work with HCDC and some of the businesses with them.
Great, thanks. Nagesh.
Hello. My name is Nagesh. I am the co-founder of small startup company. It's a material and consulting company. We work with advanced materials and bridge the gap between technology push and market pull, and help the smooth transition of the new materials into commercial applications. If we focus on polymer composites, polymeric materials, focus primarily onto the automotive applications. So we're currently working with certain OEMs for creating some advanced composite parts that can be used on their hoods, doors, and other parts on the truck.
Great, thanks.
Thank you.
Matt.
Hi, I'm Matt Beischel. I'm with Corvus CRO, and I am a UX consultant, mostly focused on e-commerce website experience and helping improve website conversions.
Great. Apps.
Hey guys, sorry I'm late. Was watching the inauguration. Appleway Garcia, the founder, president of HealthGuard. We're about a 10-person company that helps small, mid-sized hospital systems manage, analyze and manage the risk. We are also an HCDC customer, and we were an ERA customer many years ago, thinking maybe we need to look at that again.
Great. And then last but not least, Norm.
Hi, I'm Norm Husar. I'm with Norm Husar Strength and Conditioning. Norm's the name, shoulder pain's my game. Trying to help some folks get rid of pain.
Nice. Nice tagline. I love it.
Thanks.
We'll have to have you come in and do the some of the prospecting and marketing talks that we do. Great. Yeah. Well, wanted to just make.
I'm happy to help.
Yeah. So, part of this again is not just connecting the subject matter experts to you, but also you to each other. So at the end, after Jeff and Kathy talk, whatever time remains, we could use to then have you connect and discuss some of the challenges, successes, things that are top of mind for you as business leaders with your companies, to see if any peer collaboration, peer learning can help. And then one last kind of announcement before I turn it over to Jeff. But as a reminder, on every third Wednesday every month, we have the huddle. The upcoming 2 sessions we have are first, we've got Kendra Ramirez, who is a B2B marketing and sales expert, runs her own company here locally in Cincinnati, and she'll be speaking on the 17th of February. Not only will we talk about LinkedIn, but we'll talk about all the different types of tools and how-tos to help you amplify your B2B marketing efforts. And then in March, on March 17th, we've got Andrew Goldner, who runs a VC company called GrowthX that specializes in bringing operators, so people that have expertise in go-to-market strategy and helping you prove out your business models. And they've got a concept on prototyping and thinking about your go-to-market plan from that VC that we'll have on in March. So mark your calendars, make sure you come. We'll keep sending out reminders. But just, with that, we'd love to turn it over to Jeff to talk about some of the HR pitfalls that an employee handbook can help alleviate.
Thank you. And before we kick off, I'll just give you a little bit of quick background of ERA and as well as myself. So ERA, we are a HR consulting firm out of Cincinnati. We have 2 offices, Cincinnati and Columbus. But really what we service is really the Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky regions. So we pride ourselves on kind of being a one-stop shop for HR. We offer a lot of services that kind of run the gamut of your normal HR department. And we do that for, companies as small as 2 employees to companies as large as, tens of thousands of employees. So we really do kind of run the gamut in terms of the companies that we work with and the type of projects that we normally do. So my role at ERA is survey manager and HR consultant. I have been with ERA for close to 10 years. I am a licensed attorney in the state of Ohio, and my day-to-day type of work is working with organizations, answering questions about compliance-related issues, HR-related issues. So when it comes to handbooks, it's an easy type of topic to discuss because it gets into the practicality of the day-to-day business. And you'll kind of see as I touch base here, the next couple of slides, we'll kind of see how a handbook is, the organization's opportunity to start defining how they're going to operate and kind of giving the organization a type and giving you all the opportunity to think about the procedures and how you want to go about addressing it and trying to plan for the future. So with that, I'll kick off and I'll start sharing my screen here. So if it doesn't pop up, let me know. All right, and we'll make it
Cool.
There we go.
And then everyone, if you don't mind, go on mute. And then if you have questions, I'll be playing moderator for questions. Feel free to send them in the chat, and then that'll be our alert for you to go off mute at the right stopping point for Jeff to respond to the question.
Yeah, and we will pause as well as that we'll pause through, and I'll just kind of pause for questions. I will tell you, what we're going to cover today is going to be a lot of information, but it's not everything. So if you're seeing things, I'm not talking about that you've maybe heard in the past or considered adding to your handbook. Please know that we're just kind of hitting probably the most important areas and the areas where if you don't have it could result in some trouble for you. So that's kind of what we're covering. It's not everything, but it's definitely going to be a lot of useful information, I think, to either update your current handbook or to help you with the implementation of your new one. And so what we're going to do today is first just talk about the importance of handbooks, kind of what role they serve in the operational day-to-day business of the organization. We'll talk about the kind of the important topics that every handbook should have. And then we'll also take a few minutes just to talk about how legislation at the state level and even as far down as at the city level can impact what your handbook says or the policies that you want to put in place. A lot of this is going to be driven by federal law, but it's always important when you're drafting handbooks to look at state and city ordinances just to make sure that you are compliant with those as well. And then lastly, what we'll look at is just general guidelines for handbooks, sound practices, things to make sure that you're doing day in and day out to ensure that one, the handbook is compliant, and two, it can be an effective tool for you should any kind of any kind of lawsuit be raised against the organization. And so first, handbooks in themselves can communicate not only policies, the day-to-day policies, but as well as the mission and the value of the organization. So they can be a useful recruiting tool, as well as an employee morale, a way to boost employee morale. So take in the handbook, outside of the policies, but take the opportunity to really spell out the mission and value of the organizations. Demonstrate to the employees, why they're valued, as well as it's the opportunity to hold the employees and the organization accountable. So in the handbook, what you want to communicate is, fair and equal treatment for employees, as well as established procedures for handling potential issues that you might see in the workforce. And the reason we do that up front is so that we can be fair and consistent with employees. When it comes to, discrimination lawsuits or any type of, employment issue that could result in future complaints being filed, it's typically coming down to one of two things, either kind of a discrimination or retaliation claim. And so handbooks are a great way to try and eliminate at least the first, if not second. So outlining procedures, thinking them through, making sure they're consistent becomes a kind of an important goal for the organization in general, but the handbook can be a useful tool in kind of outlining those procedures up front. And then next we talked about setting expectations. So the handbook is a great way to set expectations for employees, how they're going to behave, what performance standards are expected of them, how they should, communicate, or what kind of procedures for complaints, how all of that should be handled. And really, it's setting expectations, again, not only for the employees themselves, but for the organization, because the goal is obviously to sustain a strong culture. And as we lay out the policies and communicate to them, it really helps that transparency within an organization. So employees know the correct procedures to follow and what is acceptable and unacceptable behavior. And then lastly, just on this slide, we talk about legal protection. And I'll get into this a little bit later when we get into harassment and discrimination policies. But really, a handbook can be a useful tool if there is any type of lawsuits or discrimination claims or anything like that brought up against the organization. The handbook can be that first line of defense that an organization can use to say, listen, here's our handbook, here's our policies, this is what we follow. And so the claim of discrimination or retaliation or anything like that goes against our handbook. And at that point, again, it's just kind of that first line. It's not foolproof, but it is kind of that first line of defense in any type of lawsuit. And then lastly here, we just want to touch base. The handbook should allow the organization to adapt in the future. And what I mean by that is you're setting out a system of policies and procedures, but in that end, it should allow the organization to change, whether it's because of growth or because of a change in the business structure. Whatever the reason, the handbook should outline the policies, but also allow, allow for the unpredictable. So what's going to happen tomorrow? Going back to February of 2020, there were handbooks there that didn't address infectious diseases or how we were going to handle employees that were coming into the workforce sick. And I can assure you that, everyone I've talked to since February, March of last year up until yesterday, that's a question I bring up. What does your handbook say about these things? Because if we're able to change, we can address the unpredictable. And so what we're looking at for in handbooks is disclaimers that say handbook can be changed at any time. No contract exists, and we'll get into a little bit, but that's really dealing with at will employment status. And then that changes will have a set, any changes that's in the handbook will have a set procedure that has to be followed to really combat any kind of claims that, yeah, the handbook was changed, they didn't tell anybody, but that's not what they did. In the handbook, it gives us the opportunity, again, if there were a lawsuit or claim, to say, no, listen, the handbook was changed in accordance to this procedure as outlined here. And so again, it provides that first level of defense to say we are abiding by our handbook in the way that we did everything. And so now we're getting to kind of the bulk of the presentation, which are what's the important topics? What things should I have at the very basic level in a handbook? Whether it's updating one that's already existing or you're starting from scratch. These are some things that...
Jeff, quick question for you.
Yeah, sure.
So I remember when I was working on a company with a coffee roasting company with some friends, and we were sitting there building the LLC agreement, et cetera. It took us forever because we were building this thing that was probably like way too lengthy, you know, for what we like the stage we were at.
Mhm.
And at the time, we were thinking about whether or not we should have employees and not have employees. I guess what's the right point in time that somebody should be creating their first handbook? Is it, you know, when they're just incorporating and it's maybe, you know, just founding, owning members of a company, or is it when we're taking on our first employee? Is it, you know, a combination thereof, or?
Yeah. So there are certain periods where legislation will become effective on an organization. And so at the very beginning, you know, if you're starting out with two owners and there's a contractual agreement, that falls outside of the typical employee-employee relationship. So really the day-to-day type of operations are going to be driven by that contract. When it comes to handbooks, what we're looking for is more of that employee-employer relationship. And it's providing that, you know, it's basically providing how that relationship will work, what's the expectations. So, and this goes as well as not only with, you know, owners with the contractual, but also independent contractors. So those type of relationships fall outside of what I would probably use for an employee handbook. But when it comes to bringing people on, you know, especially if they're coming on as an at will, which we'll get to here in a few slides, that's when I would start implementing the handbook.
Got it. Thanks.
Sure. And so just to kind of hit the topics, we'll hit each of these individually with slides, but just quickly, we'll talk about, you know, at wills, anti-discrimination, anti-harassment, pay practices, right to privacy, time off and leave policies, as well as confidential or intellectual property. So just to jump in, and kind of what I was saying is that at will status, or, you know, an at will statement in your handbook. So the at will employment status, basically, if you're not familiar with it, which, you know, as businesses, I think there's only one state that doesn't default to an at will status for employees. The at will status essentially means that the employer-employee relationship can be terminated at any time, and basically for any reason. Now, I have in there any legal reason, because there are exclusions for, you know, discrimination, types of reasons that won't hold up if a claim were brought. But what you're looking at is basically any time or any legal reason. Also, at will status can be terminated with or without notice. So, you know, it's not that far reaching to say that at any time you could walk into any one of your employees and say, you know, hey, it isn't working out. You know, there's no notice, there's no steps you have to walk through. At least at the very basic level, it's simply in this at will status. Now, at will won't exist if there's a contract between the two parties. That employment contract will probably outline some kind of just cause reason for termination. But in the state of Ohio, the way that the legislation is written, it defaults to an at will status between employer and employee. And really what it speaks to is there must be consensus from both parties to change that status. And so what they're basically saying is that you have to go out of your way, and they employ in the basically the mindset for both parties has to be, we are going to create something that's going to be different than the at will status. And so what you're looking at it, you know, if you're bringing employees on, it's probably going to be an at will type of an arrangement. At that point, you're getting into termination, end the relationship, no notice, no reason. And then when it comes to handbook, what you want to get into from the at will statement perspective is a clear and unambiguous statement, basically at the very beginning of the handbook. that is going to outline this is an at-will relationship. Nothing in the handbook, any kind of details that are discussed moving forward are going to change that status. And we'll kind of see how that could, come into play a little bit later. But some of the things I have here is, these phrases or these words could be used in the handbook. And outside of the state of Ohio, as I kind of talked about, but they could be used as, reasons to think that the at-will status might have changed. And those are typically things related to permanent positions, job security, or even some type of progressive discipline that is always going to be followed. And so the practicality of that, at least the discipline part is, as everyone is probably familiar with, if you have an employee who's going through the disciplinary steps, it's a verbal, written, and final termination. What we don't want in the handbook is a promise that that is always going to be followed. And the reason is because there are some things that, a verbal or written warning is appropriate. Coming in late, leaving early, taking an extra break. There are other things that are basically going to bypass those first two steps and just result in immediate termination. So those types of promises where, hey, we're always going to follow these three steps could lead to a change in that status of at will, because it's to a point of, hey, you didn't follow these three steps, and now I've got a claim on the back end. And next, we'll look at the anti-discrimination, anti-harassment policies, and retaliation policies within the handbook. So what you really want is a broad policy statement that is against discrimination and harassment in the workplace. And when we're talking about, those areas, we're talking about all types: sexual, hostile work environment, any other types, bullying, any type of inappropriate behavior we want to cover in this section. And you also want to advise employees that, hey, the organization will not tolerate this, and this will lead to disciplinary action up to termination. So you want a really strong, really broad policy that talks about the organization being against, obviously, discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. And this part really gets into a little bit of, what Paul had brought up a few minutes ago about, when is a good time to have a handbook. This will also change. There are obviously federal laws that will speak to anti-discrimination, anti-harassment. Title VII, Americans with Disability Act, Age Discrimination Act. All of those have an employee threshold, if you will, that says, okay, if anybody with 15 or 20 employees, this becomes applicable to you. There is a caveat to that, which is at the state level, and whereas Ohio will lower that threshold. So instead of 15 to 20, it could be a lowest threshold as maybe 4 employees, or subject to all employers within the state of Ohio. So that's why, as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to look at the state regulations as well as federal, because if we're only looking at federal, we're going to miss things. We're going to miss restrictions or compliance issues that have to be in place based upon either state or city regulation. And so when it comes to the anti-discrimination and anti-harassment and retaliation, what do we want in those sections? Essentially, what we want is a complaint system, the description of the complaint system, to let the employees know how complaints of discrimination and harassment will be handled by the organization. It can be as simple as make a complaint to your supervisor or make a complaint to the owner. But where it can get tricky for organizations, especially small organizations, is what happens when the person who I'm telling to go complain to, so if it's HR, more likely, president or the owner. What happens when it's that individual that is doing the discriminatory or harassing or bullying behavior? Where does that employee have to go? And so that's, a kind of a critical decision in terms of when you're drafting the handbook, is thinking, okay, what about X? What about Y? And thinking through those things ahead of time, so that if something does happen in the future, we've addressed it. We're prepared for it. And so at that point, if it is, 2 or 3 employees within an organization, it might be something as, okay, hey, we have a relationship with an outside attorney who complaints can go there, and that kind of initiates the investigation, or kind of an outside party to do that type of, to help to kind of address that situation, and there's steps in place about what actually goes on. And so it can get kind of complicated when you're trying to work with those relationships, but it's important to plan ahead in those type of things, because we want to establish a policy. If there is a complaint with, the discrimination or harassment, we want to be able to address it immediately, rather than wait a couple days and try and figure it out. At which point, the employee starts to get upset, or is continuing to experience bullying behavior or harassment, and then goes to file a hostile work environment type of claim. And then with anti-retaliatory statements, what we want to include, again, is that procedure. What is going to happen if, for instance, let's say I'm an employee and I raise a claim, I'm being harassed. The employee, the employer is addressing it, but in the meantime, my supervisor is coming down on me and retaliating against me, being extra hard on me for performance, or punish me in some other way. Again, we want a procedure to know how to address that, and it's set up up front so the employee can obviously address it in the correct manner, as well as knows where to go, and is not sitting in kind of limbo as they're being retaliated against. And then one thing you'll hear me talk about a little bit later is protective classes. And really what these are, this phrase is more commonly used with Title VII at the federal level, which is, individuals of protected class, sex, race, gender, are subject to protections within the workforce. So when we talk about protected classes, just know that, again, we're looking at the federal level, as well as city and states can add on to that protected list. So it's maybe not just what's set up by Title VII, but Ohio has additional classes that are also protected that have to be included in the handbook. And then the last kind of bit I'll talk about that quickly is it actually was a relevant topic. I think it was a couple weeks ago. Governor DeWine had signed the latest legislation for employment law in Ohio. And what it did was clean up a little bit of older legislation in terms of harassment and discrimination claims in the state of Ohio. But what the legislation did, and as it applies to kind of this conversation, it talks about setting up basically a first line defense for employers. And what the legislation says in bold print is essentially the employer can have a first line kind of affirmative defense in a harassment claim if they've got an effective harassment policy in their handbook, and the employee is properly educated about the policy and the complaint procedures. So when we talk about the importance of the handbook and avoiding legal issues, the handbook can serve as that first line of defense if it's set up correctly. So again, this was something that was signed just about 2 weeks ago, and is set to, I think it's set to become effective in April. But that is kind of a real life example about how useful handbooks can be in the unfortunate event that you do have a claim brought against the organization. And the next topic we'll talk about is just pay practices. A lot of the pay practices are going to be governed by federal law, so the Fair Labor Standards Act. This is the legislation that talks about exempt, non-exempt status for employees. When does overtime have to be paid? How much does overtime have to be? What is considered a break time or an employee taking a break, and whether or not it has to be paid. So it covers a wide range of pay practices that an organization would have to be in compliance with. And so, that is kind of the first step when we look at any type of pay practices. But again, that caveat of looking at state and local restrictions. And so within the handbook in itself, what you're looking at, to kind of cover is, payment of wages. When will you be paid? Meal and rest breaks, timekeeping, overtime eligibility. And then when you get into, other scenarios, it's, lactation accommodation, and then any type of reimbursement for business, traveling for business reasons. So all of those things, again, can be kind of outlined in a handbook up front so that your employees know how it's going to be handled moving forward. Okay, and I will just take a break. Paul, I don't know if we've got any other questions, or if anybody would like to unmute themselves, and I can kind of pause here for a few questions.
Yeah, we aren't getting any questions. I mean, so it sounds like there's a lot of useful elements that help provide a first, not line of defense, but a first kind of basic expectations that can help serve your advantage, right? In the case of any potential disputes or challenges. Obviously, aside from the first priority is helping just paint a picture of where you want to go with your company and how employees are going to play a role, right?
Absolutely. And a lot of things when you're coming to, and we'll kind of speak to it here with the right of privacy, but in any kind of claim, the court is going to look at your handbook. It's going to say, what was the expectation set up front? And did either the company violate that, or did they fail to deliver on that? And so, it's that type of upfront communication is extremely important, especially when it comes to this right of privacy that we're going to talk about. Because what you're setting up there is, and it's a legal phrase, but it's expectation of privacy. And so what you're looking at is communicating what level of privacy or expectation of privacy, or in this case, none, that an employee has while they're using company equipment or on company property. And so this is one that I think should be really over communicated, if you will, meaning not just in the handbook, but perhaps a release anytime that, an employee would have computer equipment or using any type of, email system or anything like that, where it could be essentially something that needs to be searched. And over communicating that says, hey, there is no expectation of privacy here. So if we want to search it, we're going to search it. And especially in Ohio, what we've seen is the courts have consistently come down and saying, the employer's action in monitoring is lawful. And in kind of that analysis, what they're going to look for is the handbook. And to say in that handbook, was there a reasonable expectation of privacy set up ahead of time? So the more we can communicate it, the more we can establish it, the better case that we have to say, listen, we set up the expectations that the employee, when using our computer, using our cell phone, or on company property, has almost no reason of expectation of privacy. And of course, there's caveats to what that goes to in terms of monitoring employees' activity. But what we are trying to do is set that baseline to say there is no expectation, as we're kind of in that day-to-day operation of using our equipment or being in our on our property. And then just below here, I just have a few, exact kind of examples, if you will, that I've pulled from our handbook template. So we have a handbook template on file, which we update each year. And for member companies, they can access that and basically use it to kind of build their own. And so these are just two quick samples that I have that kind of talk about the privacy aspect of it. And essentially they set the baseline of when you're using our equipment, when you're on our property, no expectation. And you can kind of see in the second bullet, it gets down to, a vehicle, office, desk, and then it gets into the electronic, tablets, cell phones, computers. So it really does lay it out in saying that anything, it might be company owned that you're using, is not going to have any kind of expectation of privacy when you're using it. And a lot of these where we usually kind of see it come up is, cases where an employee might be using like a personal email account on a company computer. It gets a little bit more complicated as we go down that rabbit hole, but that is something we typically see is when they're using a third-party communication source on that company computer about what we can see and what we can access. That's where it gets a little bit complicated. But what we want first of line is that hey, if you're using our equipment, there's no expectation of privacy moving forward.
Hey, Jeff, quick question on that.
Yeah.
How do we think about in the event that you've got an employee that uses their own computer and their own, elements, their own phones, et cetera, right? As it relates to management of that elements, is it just, okay, well, then we know that that's their own personal computer, thus, there's just a, less control you have per se in that space?
Yeah, it gets a little bit more complicated. And as we've seen the, bring your own devices to work movement, and it's been the last, I'd say, 10 years, if not longer, we've kind of seen that transform, and it's gotten a little bit more complicated. Now, if you'll see it, and I know when I sign on to email on my phone, it's my personal phone, I've got my work email on it. But there is basically a notification that, and you can have it in place that says, hey, because we're putting email on there, we can access this device. And there are, it's a complicated kind of balance between what we can search and what we can have access to. But just know that there is avenues to basically have the employee sign off that they're going to have company email or anything like that, they can kind of be granted access. Now, there are a lot of caveats I won't get into, because when we talk about private information on a phone versus a company accessing it, it can get really, a little complicated. But there are avenues in terms of setting that expectation up beforehand, as the employee might come on and start using their own personal devices for business reasons. All right, and next we'll talk about, what I'll get into is the time off and leave, leave of absence policies. And really what this is getting down into, again, is your standard offerings in terms of, vacation, PTO, as well as other things that, might be offered in the future. It may not be a concern for you right now, just depending on the operation. You may not have a set policy for vacation. It may just kind of be hey, if you need to take a day, take a day. But it is something that, as you're going to bring on more employees, it will be helpful for you to sit down and think about what's going to be offered. So do we want to do, a vacation versus a PTO type of system? What other things are we going to do? What holidays are we going to offer? Are we going to be closed whole days, part days, on either the holidays or the day before the holidays? Is there going to be sick leave? Is there going to be any type of medical leave of absence? What are we going to do for military leave, jury duty, bereavement? Those types of things, when they're included in the handbook, can outline for the employees about what is offered, and especially when it comes to vacation, PTO types of things, how they will go about requesting that time, the amount of time that they're given, and as well as reserve a right for the organization to basically deny that request because of various reasons. But this section will kind of let you outline that procedure, and again, communicate to the employee about what is offered and how they go about requesting it. And so typically what we will see here, and I don't believe when we did the introductions, I don't think anybody has to worry about this now, but in this section, when we talk about, FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act, this is a time where you would kind of set up that requesting procedure, the fact that the benefit is offered to employees. So this can be, as companies grow and become more mandated for different types of leave, this is where we can really hone in on those requirements as well. Again, what we're looking at as state and local laws to ensure that what we're offering is in compliance with those restrictions. And to, again, even in 2020 and 2021, a handbook presentation, I can weave in COVID topics. So here is really what we saw, kind of a big thing take place at the end of last year, which is there was legislation passed going back all the way to April 2020, the Family First Coronavirus Relief Act. You may have heard it, you may have not, but at the very base level, what it was offering was at least one benefit for employees that were potentially sick or were sick with COVID-19. And it essentially just provided them pay time off for about 2 weeks, for 10 days. And at the end of last year, so the legislation was written so that it expired December 31st. So the legislation as a whole basically had a timestamp on it that it was going to go away at the end of the year. But what we saw at kind of the state level across the country was individual states passing paid sick leave legislation that had an expiration date that was beyond the end of last year. And so as companies were updating handbooks with COVID procedures, that was something that we wanted to bring up and say, listen, at the federal level, this is what the leave is, but know that individual states and individual cities are going to have additional leave, and it's not just going to all go away December 31st. It's something that to pay attention to, and kind of on a more, outside of the COVID realm, the day-to-day, what we might see is statewide FMLA, statewide paid sick, statewide, pregnancy accommodation types of things that will derive a employee's right to request some type of leave. So it, again, I keep repeating because it is important to look at the state and local levels, because they can throw a wrinkle into any type of handbook if it's not done properly.
Hey, Apps has got a question. Apps, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Kind of a two-parter, Jeff. The first part is we offer unlimited vacation for our full-time employees, and we have 10 company holidays, and those are currently paid for part-time employees who are hourly. If we decide to change any of that along the way, for whatever reason, what's the process? Is it simply just rewrite the handbook and then distribute it and communicate it? Is that pretty much it?
Yeah, and when it comes to employer offered policies of themselves, or benefits in this case, you are really kind of the master of the domain in terms of you can drive how many vacation days are offered, what holidays we are gonna basically close and not be working. So anything like that, there isn't really any type of legislation that says it has to be this, at least at the federal level. So yeah, if you want to change, the number of PTO days that are offered, or vacation days, or what holidays are open or closed, I will say from an employee relation morale type of thing, there's a right way to do it. I wouldn't just simply throw out the new handbook, day one and say, this is what we're doing. But yeah, from a compliance standpoint, it's simply the organization can really just drive what is offered in terms of the vacation and the holidays.
Okay, thanks.
Absolutely. Any other questions?
Yeah, quick question that, so apps kind of mentioned it as it relates to their space, in terms of how they have unlimited PTO. That's something that I've seen happen or pop up more and more with companies. What are some of the, strong things about it, but then some of the challenges that might exist that, that you've seen, right? That, can be areas that can potentially create issues, if any, right? I mean, there might not be any.
Yeah, no, and and I think going back even as far as, let's say, 5-6 years, if not further, we saw that kind of pop up in the media or news stories. It was typically larger organizations that were saying, as a recruiting tool, hey, we're offering unlimited PTO or unlimited sick. And the caveats are usually, when you would read into those stories, sometimes what you would see it was only for a certain population of the organization, or it was subject to whatever kind of restrictions. But it becomes kind of a cultural organizational choice about whether or not that's not going to work, or whether it will work for your organization. So sometimes what we're seeing is the unlimited PTO offering really results in people taking less time. I think that was like 2 or 3 years ago. They did a study, because rather than coming at it from a use it or lose it type of policy, or yeah, you can roll days over, but you're only rolling over 5 days or a certain set of hours, that type of system pushes employees to use the time before they go up losing. So they're taking days, they're not really doing anything, they're not going on vacation, they're not going on trips, but they're just taking the day because they don't want to lose it. And so with the unlimited, what we were seeing is, there wasn't that push to, basically beat out the clock and use the time that they're going to lose. So I think it was, I can't remember who did the study, but it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, and they looked at it and they said, the offering is actually resulting in employees taking less time, because there's no need to really drive employees to basically use the time before they lose it. And so obviously some of the challenges is going to fall into the realm of people abusing the system. And that's when we talk about, vacation requests, leave policies, we are going to have that caveat of all requests are up to management's discretion. Because if I've got an employee that says, hey, unlimited vacation, I'm going to take every Monday and Friday off. And, hey, it's unlimited policy. The management discretion becomes kind of one where, hey, yeah, you can do that. We're going to deny the leave because we've got work to do. But it also becomes kind of a performance standard type of thing. So when we talk about meeting job expectations, meeting performance expectations, if you've got somebody taking every Monday and Friday off, chances are not they're not getting all their work done. And so at that time, what you need, if you're going to do that type of policy, is really strong supervisors, really strong management that's going to be watching the performance and making sure everything is getting done. Because if I'm taking 2 days every week off, chances are my performance or the things that I'm able to get done on a weekly basis are going to fall. And at that point, we address it from a performance standpoint. And after a while, you know, if performance doesn't improve, we've got enough to go ahead and terminate. So the challenge is, you know, to the system, I think it only works in, you know, a certain culture or a certain type of organization. And when I've seen it work the best is where there's a strong management group or kind of first line supervisors that are monitoring it and making sure employees are keeping up with the performance expectations.
Hey, Jeff and Paul, just a quick anecdotal, you know, piece here. So we've yet to have anyone abuse it. As a matter of fact, I have to tell my team to take time off. I'm literally telling them, okay, you need, just sensing the tone of the team, and if I feel they're getting burnt out, I say, you know, you need to take next week off, or, you know, plan a vacation next month. And it's not an option. I'm telling them you're off. The other piece of that is that we're an agile shop, so we have that continuous daily stand-up process with our scrum cycles, our sprint cycles, and so we always, you know, we're always, our fingers on the pulse of our production. So
absolutely, and more times than not, that is exactly how I see those systems go into place, where, you know, it's in a culture where, you know, employees are going to walk, you know, and you know, depending on the organization, they could remote work. So, you know, if it's hey, I was gonna take a vacation day because I've got a doctor's appointment, or somebody, you know, a repairman coming to the house, those types of things, you know, if it's remote, they'll just work remotely and let someone in to come repair something. So those types of issues where we maybe see kind of abuse or kind of taken away because of the flexibility of the workplace, and letting them kind of work, if they can, obviously at the home, or you know, for a full or partial day. But yeah, I mean, usually what we see with those unlimited types of vacation PTO plans is not, abuse is not something we see a whole lot of, but it's more of the opposite side, where just employees aren't taking vacation or not taking as much as they would have, as I kind of mentioned prior to the implementation of that policy.
Great, thanks. We've got about a half hour, so just time check there.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciate these questions. They're great, and I love the back and forth dialogue. So if anything else, obviously feel free to chime in. But what I'll just cover kind of quickly here, just so we've got enough time, a confidential or intellectual property. And with this, what we're going to look at is we're discouraging the improper use or disclosure of any type of confidential information for the organization. The best policies that we will see written for this will do a couple of things. One, they're going to define specific types of information that's going to remain confidential. They're going to avoid any type of language that is, you know, referencing employee or personal records, and I'll kind of talk to that a little bit here. And then, you know, when we're talking about specifically defining the types, we're also wanting to avoid overly broad policies. And the reason for that, and kind of what we're talking, the discouraging or including personnel or employee records, is that there are a couple of, you know, legislative bodies, administrative bodies that will look at those policies and essentially see them as kind of a violation. Particularly what we would see on the SEC, or if you're looking at the National Labor Relation Act, or the NLRB, the National Relations Board, they will look at those overall broad policies to say, you know, that is or could be a limitation on an employee's right to discuss with each other the conditions of the workforce, conditions of management, the quality of treatment from management. And just to give you a little bit, you know, background, so the National Labor Relations Act really protects that communication between employees. And so you've probably almost always heard of this in the context of union or unionized shops, but really there's a second piece of it that talks about the ability for employees to engage in concerted activity. Basically, an employee being able to talk to another employee about the conditions of the workforce. And so when we're talking about it in terms of, the sharing of confidential or proprietary information, because it connects with an employee's right to communicate with one another, we want to make sure it's not overly broad, because whether or not we're a unionized shop, if we're limiting the concerted activity, that communication between employees, we could be in trouble from a compliance standpoint. And it's very similar. This is the exact line of thinking that we will see in social media policies. So policies where the employer is trying to limit activity of the employee when they are discussing the organization, whether it's management or unfair treatment or anything like that. We have to be very careful with those types of policies, because they can broach the line where it's considered a violation of the NLRA, in which case the board will look down and kind of potentially fine you as not being compliant with those restrictions. And then, so kind of jumping next sections, and I know we're running out of time, so quickly just pause here if anybody has any questions. And if not, we'll just jump into the legislation aspect of it. Okay. So quickly, you've heard me say it probably now half a dozen times about the importance of state and local regulations when it comes to handbook drafting. And so what we wanted to do was, again, just kind of highlight some of the things that we want to be on the lookout for as we are writing handbooks for not only obviously employees in Cincinnati, employees within the state of Ohio, but in the future, if we're going to jump to different cities, if we're going to have employees in different cities or different states, what are some things to be on the lookout for? And those things are, again, the protected classes, as I talked about earlier, but leave laws, any kind of reasonable accommodations for things like such as disability, pregnancy, age, those types of things. Asking about criminal and salary history, legalization of marijuana, that along with the criminal salary has been one that's been pretty popular here over the past couple years as more states have made changes to their legislation regarding those two topics. And then lastly here, data protection. This is one that we are seeing, it's in its infancy. I think it's not even in a handful of states yet. But I know that California and Illinois have passed legislation that talk about the protection of employee data by the employer. So it's one of those, like, that is going to be the new growing trend kind of moving forward, is that data protection. We've seen legislation for consumer data protection, obviously, but now it's coming from an employer standpoint as well. And I would not expect anything coming soon, at least for the state of Ohio. We could be 10 years or more out until we see anything, but just know that typically what we see with legislation is it starts in certain states and then grows kind of in popularity as the years go by. And so quickly here, we talk about the differences between cities and states. Protected classes. So there's differences in terms of the protected classes, or the definition of a protected class, in Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, and Toledo. So even when we're talking within the state of Ohio, there's essentially 4 differences based upon the city that you're operating in. Leave laws, we've kind of already talked about that a little bit. The criminal and salary history, what we see is about 36 states and 150 cities have adopted what is called ban the box. And the history of that is asking employees about criminal history on the application up front. I won't get into kind of the rationale behind it, but that is one, just as I was talking about the data protection, where we saw it start in a couple of states and has now kind of grown, as you can see there, to over 50% of the states in the country. Cincinnati and Toledo have a prohibition on asking about salary history. Again, what you're looking there is trying to discourage unequal pay, particularly for female and minorities. So if they've been discriminated against, what the city is trying to do is to stop that from growing forward as we, ask a candidate, hey, what would you like to be, or what were you paid in your last roles? But rather asking them, what was your desired, what's your desired compensation moving forward? So those types of things where we're trying to curb unfair treatment moving forward, but that is really driven by at the city level right now, at least in these two here in the state of Ohio. And then lastly, the legalization of marijuana. I'm sure everyone has seen the news stories. Another state will pass either medical or recreational legislation, but that again is impacting, not only drug screens, but as well as reasonable accommodations for disabilities. So I believe right now there is 1 or 2 states that allow the use of marijuana as a reasonable accommodation for a medical condition. So those types of things can impact what language you have in your handbook, as well as a communication about a drug-free workplace and things like that. So while not necessarily directly impact as directly as on the background, on the drug screen, but it can indirectly impact other sections of the handbook that you might need to address. And then lastly here, just the last couple slides.
Quick question, Jeff.
Yeah.
So, hour and 40 minutes ago or so, there was a new administration that was inaugurated. Main question is like, hey, from your purview, right? What are the biggest potential, if any? Maybe there's none. Maybe it's slow moving enough where this doesn't impact an employee handbook as much. But could there be things that, whether you like it or not, people should be aware of as they're thinking about employment practices with the current administration that's coming in, and with any potential change that happens obviously every 4 years?
Yeah, absolutely. And, as we see administrations change, there is a whole host, obviously, of other agencies and legislative bodies that change with it. And so, what you'll see is, more, maybe more communication about, the Biden administration goals for employer practices from Secretary of Labor, or you'll see, especially when we were talking about the NLRB, that is a body of basically it's a mix of Democrat and Republicans, and really the history of that is essentially if the administration in the White House is Democratic Republic, that will define the majority of the votes for that body. And we have seen it, we saw it with the Obama administration, we saw it with the Trump administration, and I no doubt we'll see it with the Biden administration, where a new NLRB body will come in and undo some of the decisions that were previously handed down by the previous group. So as we see the new administration come in, we're going to see their legislative agenda come down and impact. So I believe there's talk of the new relief bill that's going to include, I think now President Biden will be trying to push for a higher minimum wage, more paid sick leave legislation. All of that comes down to, what can be done by executive order, which is more geared towards, federal contractors, where they have a kind of a direct requirement to follow federal rule, versus what he can get passed by Congress and get enough votes for and actually become law at the federal level for everybody. So there will be changes, undoubtedly. Right now it's speculation because it depends on how the votes will come down on some things, but absolutely the administration can really flip everything upside down and go from, whether it's employer friendly or employee friendly, and kind of flip that on its head.
I guess so Norm has a question here in a second, but what's the best way? Like are there any simple tools, simple news sources, things that people can follow to help just them keep abreast to what's going on and nimble? I guess, what would you recommend?
The biggest piece for me is really that if you can identify, like Department of Labor, if you were just kind of coming at this without any type of background, that as simple as going to the agencies that will push out legislative alerts as well as guidance about how to interpret those. So what we saw with the as I was mentioning earlier, the Family First Coronavirus Relief Act, that bill got passed. It was something like 110 pages. The guidance that the DOL provided kind of broke it down and say this is how it applies to businesses. This is how you can interpret it. So even staying abreast of the things with the legislative alerts, aligning yourself with organizations like ERA, we will do updates for impacted businesses. So if it's us, if it's Chamber of Commerce, those type of organizations are usually a good source of communicating that out to employers. Just falling in line with legislative alerts, emails, things like that. That typically is kind of the best way to get a high level view of the changes. And then if you would need to kind of break down and get into the nitty gritty of the legislation, how it might impact your organization, that's where my advice would be talking to somebody, talking to an attorney to get the real life applicability to the organization.
Great. Norm, you have a question?
Yeah, Jeff, I was just wondering, is there any issues asking someone on a job application in Cincinnati or Cleveland if they've had a felony?
So I don't know Cleveland. I would have to look that up. But right now there is no, at least as far as I know, I'd have to double check Cleveland. So when I say this, I'll mainly talk about Cincinnati, but that is ban the box legislation where we're talking about it up front. So right now, Ohio has not adopted that. But what I will tell you is that it's moving that way. The country is moving that way. And the EEOC, which is the government administrative body, has come out and basically said that that is a potential form of discrimination if you were to basically remove someone from consideration based upon criminal history. Now, they're not talking about violent crimes, or they're not talking about for example, if you're hiring a CFO or hiring an accountant and they've got a felony for embezzlement, those types of things. But what they're talking about is, a candidate committed a felony 10 years ago, and they served their time, they've been released, there's been no charges, and we're essentially excluding them because of that felony conviction. That's where it could get into trouble. So I can double check and get back with you about Cleveland and kind of give you the summary, but I will tell you that the trend is going that way, is get it off your application. And if you want to have a policy in place about criminal history, you can do so with a background check that'll be done after the offer has been made to the candidate.
Thank you.
Sure.
So would you just make the offer contingent on a clean background check then?
Yes. Yeah. An offer, and it'll work the same way as a drug screen. So this is an offer contingent on you passing the background check and the drug screen if you were to offer that.
Okay.
And so I know I'm coming up on time. These last couple of slides are really just best practice. The one thing I'll highlight on this slide is the signed acknowledgement. Anytime you're going to implement a handbook or make changes, what I'm going to advise you to do is to get a signature, get acknowledgement from the employee that they have a copy, they've read it, and they understand it. That is a pretty good tool to have in the file if they were to raise a claim and say, well, I never read that. I never understood this. You can come to them and say, listen, we have your signed acknowledgement, saying otherwise. As far as we know, this was the truth, and you did, and you understood it, and you read it. So anytime you're going to make any kind of update or implement, if you don't already have one, implement, I would get a signed acknowledgement from the employees. And then, lastly, just as a kind of a quick summary, what you're looking at is, big things: discrimination, harassment policies, make sure they're in place. You've got a strong at-will statement. And then you want to include disclaimers that are going to help you to combat any type of legal challenges. So a disclaimer about changing at will, or a disclaimer about changes to the policy in itself. And then lastly, again, I'm honing in on the look at state and city to make sure that you're not only in compliance at the federal level with federal regulation, but as well as the state and local legislation as well. And so that is what I have for the presentation. I can turn it over to Paul. You want me to go ahead and stop the sharing, Paul?
Sure, yeah. You're on the spotlight, so I'm gonna remove you from the
That's
spotlight.
fine.
We
Paul,
appreciate you being the spotlight there. It sounded like there was somebody about to ask a question. Is that
Yeah,
accurate?
I was going to ask a question about asking questions. Can we still ask questions, Paul?
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
That was kind of meta there for a second, right? Jeff, we have data security and confidentiality built into our handbook, right? So we have clauses for both of those, and specifically, Health Guard data, my company data security, but also customer data security. We're also a BYOD shop, right? So do you see any potential conflict there, saying, hey, if we're telling you got to use your own devices, but at the same time you need to meet certain security standards, running antivirus, keep it updated, except strong authentication, et cetera, et cetera.
So not really, especially when we're talking about, my background with the consumer data and data security. It's not as strong as in the HR realm, but what I will tell you is that the legal trend is really protection of consumer data. So if we are putting, practices in place that is going to make the data more secure and to protect consumer data, you're probably going to be okay. What you want to get, what you want to watch yourself with is where the protections you're putting in place are now going to run you afoul with employee types of protections that might be in place. So that's where those two can maybe kind of merge a little bit. But I will tell you that just like from an employment perspective, if I write a policy that is more employee friendly, I'm probably going to be okay from the legislative perspective, because I'm going above and beyond what I'm required to do. So if you are putting policies in place that are going to be, are going to help with consumer data protection and are going to help with data security, I think you're going to be okay. But again, I say that from, that's not my expertise, but that would be my general impression.
Okay, thanks. Good presentation, by the way.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I thank you. I appreciate all the questions.
Anybody else have questions?
Yeah, I do. It's about COVID-19. Jeff, this is probably not answerable, but our business is really reliant on my employees traveling. We've been really hand-tied over the last 9 months, mostly from a business development standpoint. I want to require my employees to get vaccinated. I've already been reached out to as an essential business to bring in one of the healthcare providers to vaccinate my staff. Is that something I can make a requirement of continued employment with my firm?
There are exceptions, particularly with ADA and religious exemptions. So there are areas in which you won't be able to require it. But as we're operating today, there is basically guidance from the DOL that has said, yes, you can mandate that your employees are vaccinated. Outside of those two exceptions, there's also the practicality of it. You know, what are you going to do if it's an essential employee, if it's a critical employee to your business and they refuse? You know, those types of obstacles at the business level that kind of need to be looked into with implementing that type of policy. But at least from the compliance standpoint, assuming that you're taking into consideration the ADA and the religious exemptions, you'd be fine to go ahead and mandate that.
Any other questions?
Well, if nobody else is going to answer a question, I'm always full of them. So
shoot, go for it.
So we're all employees of the company, including myself. And I mean, there's 4 of us that founded the company, but the very first thing we did was write an employee handbook. Then we all became employees of the company, just level the playing ground. If I have to terminate a senior staff and they have a non-compete and a non-solicit, is that non-compete and non-solicit, does that survive their termination or no?
So this is one where I give my lawyer answer, which is it depends. It depends on what the arrangement of the agreement says. So there are, especially when we're talking about non-compete, there are certain factors that are going to keep it enforceable, or there are certain factors that if presented to the court's going to throw out. You know, so what we typically see with non-competes that hold up is a reasonable scope for geography and a reasonable time. What that means depends on where it's getting enforced, or basically what court it's going into. But you know, it's typically with non-compete, what we're looking at is, you know, a 1-2 year type of restriction. And then again, what you're talking about from a geographic standpoint, it just kind of depends more on the business nature of it. So if you were to write something that says, you know, you can never work for another competitor or another organization in this industry, that's going to get thrown out almost immediately. But if you say it's a non-compete that's going to last for 1 year at the end of employment, and within the state of Ohio, depending on the business depending on the business and the market in itself, that might be held up. So typically they are going to last past, that's how they operate, but it's only going to be for a certain amount of time.
So in the termination agreement, what I should do is focus and reduce the time frame for the non-compete, non-solicit to make it more realistic within the jurisdiction that I'm at. But for us, we were worldwide, so it's really, geographic's a really difficult one for us, right? Our clients are anywhere.
And you can restrict it, another restriction, again, what we're talking about is reasonable. If it's a reasonable time. So if it's, any business that we could potentially, or any business that we consider a competitor, I would probably tell you to maybe try to find a little bit more specific than that.
Yeah.
But for a reasonable time. So if it's 12 months, that might be more likely to be enforceable than if you would say 3 years. It really, when it comes down to those, it's really circumstantial, or at least based upon the circumstances of the organization and then what the actual agreement says.
Okay, super helpful stuff today. I agree with Abs. This was a good meeting.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Any other questions?
Jeff, one question following up on on Paul's issue. If for example, Paul found an employee working at a competitor locally, what's the most cost-effective legal way to handle it? Would it be getting an injunction, or are there other methods?
And so this is post-termination?
Yep.
So there's really liability on, and again, this is going to be case by case, but the general understanding is that there's liability on both parties, not only the individual employee, but as well as the organization that hires him. So if there were communication that said, the employee went to the organization, the new organization said, hey, are you subject to any non-competes? And they said no. The new organization claimed, hey, we didn't know any better, and they would deal with that, appropriately. If it's going to be, an injunction versus damages, probably the first push is going to be the injunction to stop the hire. The problem is that the legal process can be relatively slow, and so you may try and get in front of a judge to stop the injunction, but perhaps that employee's already been brought on and is working by the time you can actually get in front of a judge. Wow. I'll tell you that most of the times where we have seen it in what I'll say the real life, or what you're more common to see, is the new employer will ask the candidate if they're subject to a non-compete. In which case, if that employee says, yes, I am, they'll ask for verbiage, and they'll ask to see the contract, and then they will probably either make a decision to hire them, but keep them in a part of the organization that's outside of that non-compete, or they just will have to say, I'm sorry, we can't bring you on board at this time because of the non-compete that you're subject to.
Got it. Never easy. Thanks.
It never is, yeah.
All right. Are there any other questions? These are great questions. All right. So I do not have a hard stop. We're at time, but if others want to stay on for another 15 minutes or so to share any potential challenges they have, I have some free time to continue to stay on the line. But before we get to that, just wanted to thank Jeff, Kathy, Kim from ERA, and I really appreciate your time, and thank you for the great topic. And what's the best way for them to get a hold of you in the event that there's any further questions, things that they need that they need help with going forward?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We actually defined a special offer for small business with Anthony, even in advance of this presentation. So if you guys are interested in that, or just want to talk more about the services that ERA offers and how they might help your startup, probably the best way, gosh, I don't know if Anthony's still on. You could go onto the webpage and send us a request for contact, and I can reach out. I can just provide my phone number. That's always possible. I mean, certainly Anthony and Paul know how to get a hold of us. So, yep. Kick it around. If you're wondering whether a membership or any services might benefit you, then yeah, maybe just the contact on the info. I should have thought through that, Paul.
What I'll do is when we send this out as a reminder with the video link for those that weren't able to attend, we'll just provide a reminder of, hey, here's that we have direct contacts you can go to, and here, and there's some potential special terms that can exist. So that's probably the easiest way.
Yeah, that's perfect. In fact, I think I did a flyer for Anthony, Paul. So maybe just want to attach that, and then that's got contact info and stuff on it. But
great.
We loved being here. If you have other topics, we'd love to do another one later in the year.
Yeah,